Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, we're ready to go with this interview today. I'm pleased to have with me Kisiah Timmons. Hello, Kisiah. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
I'm glad to have you as part of this podcast video cast. Where are you talking to us from today?
The Washington, D.C. area.
All right. Well, I'm 3 hours time zone difference in the Seattle area on my home office in Vashon Island. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and talk about your experiences in accessibility. Why don't we start by just talking about a little bit about what you're involved with right now?
Currently, I'm a principal technical program manager with Yahoo. Um, my main priority is to manage different engineering projects, focusing on those products that are consumer facing and that we're shipping and releasing, out the door. However, as a part of my current position as a TPM, I also manage Yahoo's company-wide accessibility remediation program.
Yeah, and that was how I think I first became familiar with your work, and so this conversation series is all about helping people see how others have found their way into supporting accessibility. So why don't we just go back in time and maybe you could kind of give us a little background of how accessibility came into your life, and we could just kind of move back up until today.
Okay. Sure thing. That's the neat thing about the accessibility field is that everyone has a different story to tell. And my story is that I basically came into accessibility the hard way. I lost the majority of my vision within 2 years of graduating with an electrical engineering degree. I was working in the consulting field at the time for a multinational consulting firm. Um, Experienced vision loss, and then all of a sudden, my world ended. I was told that no one would hire a blind engineer, and I ended up losing my job. Went through all the processes with, state Department of Labor vocational rehabilitation. Fortunately, I had a godsend and a counselor who believed that I was better than my circumstance. He believed in me, and he gave me every tool, every opportunity, every training that he could afford with his state budget to get me back on track, give me all the assistive technologies that I need. Because at the time, it's kind of rare for someone at my stature, having worked as an engineer, losing their job, and so he really saw the daylight. He saw the daylight before I did. And there were supporting people around him that kept nudging me and telling me, even though I lost that position, even though, some people said that I would never have gainful employment again, that those same engineering skills that I developed over the course of many years, even predating college, it's still very useful in regaining my career, because as an engineer, we're taught to solve problems. And so for me, I had to shift my thinking a bit and thinking of it as an engineering problem that needed to be solved. So I mastered my assistive technologies, and within 2 years of that, I ended up going back to work, was hired, doing the same type of engineering and systems analyst work for another multinational consulting firm. And at that point, it was very interesting because their systems were more complex than at the consulting firm where I was laid off for. And they told me that I could do the work. The difference this time is that I developed, a core skill set with my assistive technologies. I had it mastered, where I became, my own tech support. Whereas before I was relying on, state technologists and company IT personnel. I kept my mouth shut because I was determined. I said I'm not going to lose another job. So there were barriers that I faced, software wise, but I created scripts myself. I'm a big fan of JAWS, and that's what I used at the time. I created my own scripts to help fix the accessibility issues that I encountered. Didn't tell my manager, didn't tell anyone. I just did it because I needed to get the job done, and I was determined not to lose another job. So that was kind of like my entry point into accessibility, is that I came in it the hard way, and I came in it at a time when there really was no accessibility field. I mean, this was 20 years ago. No accessibility field. The only, person I had to rely on really was myself. And, some people, that I met along the way during voc rehab that told me that I was better than my circumstance.
Well, I mean, it's really great to hear your story, starting with such a scary health pivot in your life early on, as you're just ready to begin your career, and then the challenges that were there with technology and just people's understanding of all of our abilities, despite physical challenges. So it's really exciting to see how things have gone for you over the years. You did mention assistive technologies, a number of times, and I think. A lot of people are just exploring accessibility, may not understand how important it is to be able to, for our digital products and services to be able to fully support those assistive devices. And sounds like you had a lot of that hard work early on when it wasn't built in, but how have you seen things improve in that area over the past 20 years?
Oh wow. It's been a dramatic shift in thinking because at that time, no one, in corporate America specifically, no one really knew what an assistive technology was. No one really had experience dealing with people with disabilities. And then if they did, there were times, that they took away negativity. And that was in the first case. It played a huge role when I lost my job with my initial vision loss, was because, I remember someone saying, well, don't you need one of those loud, noisy, Braille printers? It's going to take up too much office space. And, they're just trying to, draw on every negative experience. Right. But in my mastering assistive technologies and the availability of them over time, and even becoming more mainstream, has really helped change the perceptions. For example, I remember going to a conference in the early 2000s down at Georgia Tech, and wearable computing was something that was developed for people with physical disabilities. Right now, you have all types of fitness watches, right? Mm-hmm. And they're accessible. Right. So a lot of the technology, speech recognition, you think about what Amazon has done with Echo and Alexa, right? The initial influences on those types of products, it was because of people with disabilities had hardships. But now they're becoming more mainstream. I remember when Windows PCs did not come with a built-in screen reader. Now we have narrator. And I think, the key with assistive technologies, number one, is that they've gotten more affordable, because when I first lost my vision, everything had to be paid, by your counselor, by your voc rehab. it was extremely expensive, right? To start off, getting, different types of assistive technologies. Braille displays were just, they were super expensive now. They're still expensive now, but they've come down, dramatically. So over time, the good thing about assistive technologies, as they've become embraced by mainstream society, um, we have economies of scale and prices have come down to make it more affordable, meaning that it's easily accessible to people to help bridge, that quality of life, right? To help um, make sure that we have an equal quality of life for people with disabilities and people without.
Well, what you've talked about so far is just your own uh, uh, need to be able to overcome physical challenges to participate as an engineer in the corporate workplace, and with a lot of hard work, you're able to do that. But then you took the next step, which is to become actively involved as a practitioner to improve the accessibility space. So, what was the next step? How did you move into becoming actively involved in improving accessibility?
That's a good question. So working in the consulting realm, I was involved in accessibility on behalf of myself. And back in like the mid, 2000s, it was at the height of the Iraq War, and I had the opportunity to join the Department of Veterans Affairs in Atlanta, and the focus there was trying to help rehabilitate blind and aging veterans. At that time, it was one of those things. It was kind of a crossroads for me, and I'm always fortunate to have people in my life that have advised me over time. And the notion was, Kisiah, it's time for you to come use your skills for the benefit of others. Hey, it's good. You've got it nailed for yourself, right? You've taken care of yourself. But the same type of skills that you've used to overcome, the same type of skills that you've used to succeed in the workplace, those are the same skills that are needed to help better the lives of others. And at that time, that was an important thing for me. I have to tell you, it wasn't, leaving that job at that consulting firm, that was the most difficult job to leave. Because there, I was one person, one blind person with a white cane, coming into work, taking two trains, get on the shuttle to get there. I never knew the effect that I had on people who just saw me around the office until they found that I was leaving. And that was the biggest lesson learned for me, was that they noticed me when, I really didn't see them looking, right? I didn't. But that experience, it was tough. I liked what I was doing. It was challenging. And I, had a good rapport with my colleagues and, people across the company who valued what I did, because I was able to help people internally, advocate for their accommodations. So it was very, very gratifying. But at the same time, I'm just still an engineer at the core, right? And being able to look at other types of technology, like emerging technologies, innovations, things like that, indoor wayfinding systems, smartphones, it really, really piqued my interest. And so ultimately, I ended up leaving and joining the Department of Veterans Affairs as a biomedical engineer in a research capacity. So helping to create and develop different prototypes to help support the needs of aging veterans and those who were experiencing vision loss.
And then just from what I know from your background, from your profile, then that led you into even further work developing solutions for digital products and services that others are using. So maybe tell me a little bit about that next chapter in your journey.
Yeah. So when I was at the VA, I I really started to get very enthused about smartphones, computing devices, mobile computing devices. Okay, enthused because I thought they were just super neat. They're incredible, but I couldn't use them. I could not use right the iPhone when it was originally came because it did not have the accessibility suite, right? At that time, I was using like one of the, it's like a Motorola phone. It was a Windows-based operating system, and I had to buy mobile speak to add on to that, right? Just to be able to use, a phone. But there, it was. I had a really incredible opportunity. It was a kind of a passion of mine. I wrote the proposal for it, pitched it to my team. They bought in because I wanted the VA to fund a study on smartphones because I'm thinking like this is the wave of the future. Like if we can get these smartphones into veterans' hands, they'll just open up a whole world for them. And then especially if we can, advocate for making them more accessible. Fortunately, the VA they bought onto it, and they gave us a huge grant. And that was something that was very transformative for me. That's when my passion for smartphones and tablets, mobile computing devices, that's when it really took off, right? Because, before then, everything was what you call adaptive, right? Adaptive meaning they put a product out there, right? And then they thought about, well, now we'll slap something on top of it to make it accessible to people with disabilities. Well, nowadays we're talking assistive, right? We're talking product inclusion, where now, companies, product teams are thinking about those things when they release the initial product. And that's made a world of experience. So just within, the past, I would say 10, 15 years, it's been incredible. But it was my work at the VA that really just kind of made me more passionate about mobile computing devices, smartphones, and the apps that drive them. Because for me, I saw that as the key of my mobility and to greater independence.
Well, if you're able to talk about it, what were some of the things that you felt were important areas that you moved forward in as you started working with mobile devices and making that more accessible?
It had to do, and I'm grateful for Apple because they set this incredible standard. I can't remember which version of the iPhone first had voiceover, but that was just an incredible milestone because when that happened, that drove market pressure. It wasn't overnight, right? But other phone manufacturers they started to take stock into it. So very early in the game, especially for people with vision loss, you couldn't go wrong with an Apple product, right? And that's to this day, I love my iPhone. Right? I mean, because for people with disabilities, like if you get to us first, like we have incredible brand loyalty, right? They were the first that opened that door. And so my biggest issue was that at the time, and this was, 2010, 2011, somewhere around there, at the same time, I said, well, yes, it's great, right, that we ourselves, I have this phone, right? But at the same time, as a consumer, I don't want to be held to one model, right? I should not, I should have options to choose like anyone else, right? I should have other options out there. And so I was really glad, that Google stepped up with Android and started to make Android an accessibility suite for Android to make, those phones, Android-based devices accessible, including the accessibility suite there. And that opened up a lot of doors. So for me, I really got involved in those, in like the mobile computing devices to the point where I own both. I've owned iOS devices, I've owned Android devices. I like to compare and contrast. I like, different things that I could do with some, Android devices that I couldn't do with an Apple one. I could tinker around more with the Android device. So, I mean, so it was something that was incredible, but it was a huge milestone. Starting off with Apple, and then when you started to have other companies start to adopt the accessibility suite, it was very important, because therein lies that equal access to technology. Especially because, with given choice, you have different price points. At that time, Apple didn't have a lower cost model. Android provided those options. So worldwide, you have more people, who could probably afford the Android system if it was accessible than Apple. So it's one of those things that, looking at it in hindsight, the market adopted the change, and they adopted the change because they started to value people with disabilities. It's not all about, legislation and laws and lawsuits. Yeah, that played a role into it too. But once company executives start to understand and really realize that if you build an accessible and usable product for all people, it's good for the business. It's good for the brand, right? It's good for the consumer. And it ends up improving usability, for all people, right? For people that don't even think of themselves as having a disability, namely aging seniors, right? They experience vision loss due to just natural changes in age, right? With age. They don't consider themselves, right, someone with a disability, but they rely on those technologies as well. So it's been a great journey. Not to say that everything is perfect, but just within the past 20 years since I first lost my vision, the accessibility field has grown by leaps and bounds. And it was because of those, and I really believe it's because of those, of companies starting to make their products, accessible products, more mainstream, where that accessibility field really started to take off and say, you know what? If we're going to focus on being inclusive and fully inclusive to our digital products, we need to get the experts in here to help us along the way, not slapping another software on top of it when it's all right out the door. We need to appreciate and implement the inclusive approach to product development. And that's where accessibility, professionals really fit in.
Well, I know you're moving into some new challenges in your work life, but also you're a certified professional through the IAAP. So I always like to call that out as a way for people to get just a little bit more involved, and that becomes emblematic of a commitment. But as you move forward in your next part of your career, what are some of the things that you're hoping to see as developments in accessibility?
Well, that's a good question. I think we still need to be vigilant. Technology is a great thing. It improves my independence, my quality of life. But at the same time, it takes off at such rapid speed that the accessibility portion of it, sometimes you end up playing catch up. So there are technologies out there right now, AR, XR, AI, where, we have think tanks, we have different groups that are, trying to make best practices and standards on these things. But it's important for us to continue to pursue those companies, that are putting out those products, right? Because of the fact that we don't want to get to a point where we're lagging behind significantly. Because when we lag behind as people with disabilities significantly when it comes to new technologies, there is that digital divide, right? That term, we don't really use it anymore because, back in the day, digital divide had a lot to do with, poverty and that sort of thing, but it has huge implications for people with disabilities. The digital divide, is when there's an inequity, when you have some group of people that can use a certain technology and others that are barred, right? So I think that's the challenge there, is that we have to keep striving to catch up on with emerging technologies. The other thing that I'm super passionate about, and I don't think we've made as great a stride as I would have liked, is accessibility with respect to higher education. So I got an MBA back in 2014, and my school, Drexel University, they were just superb. I got all of my books done, converted electronically. My program director worked with my professors a quarter ahead to make sure she had all the textbooks, she had time to get them sent off and convert it to electronic format so that I could use them. I thought that my experience was, like everyone else's, until I started meeting others at conferences and people that had drastically different experiences than I did. And therein lies, I'm like, we've got to get better around that, because the disparity amongst people with disabilities in gainful employment is extreme, and it's only going to get worse with technologies, moving as fast of a pace as they are. It's up to higher ed institutions. They've got to get it together, because it still amazes me the number of young people that I hear that have been told what they cannot do, and we have to stop that. Or their counselor are not being supportive. Like, we have to stop that. Or the stories about, hey, a kid can't get their accommodations, on campus. I'm like, we've got to stop that, right? And so that for me is an area where I don't think as much progress has been made as it should be. People with disabilities cannot sustain and have a great quality of life, right? If they cannot be educated, if we can't enjoy education like everyone else. That, to me, that's a right. That's a fundamental right. If a kid with a disability wants to go to college and wants to become a programmer, they need to be supported, right? Don't look at that kid and say, well, a lot of these students fail. Well, look at the reasons why they fail. The failure is not the kids. The failure, right, are on the counselors. The failures, right, are on the Department of Rehab Services on these campuses. That's where the failures are. The failures are with the professors, not the students. The students have no idea what coursework is coming down the pipeline or what types of labs are they don't know, right? That's why you have counselors. You have people there that's supposed to guide them. And I think that is a fundamental challenge that we're going to have to grapple with as an accessibility industry. So yeah, number one, we have to keep on top and stay vigilant about emerging technologies. But we also cannot forget, like, if we want to bridge the economic gap, if we want to, increase the number of people with disabilities with gainful employment, we need to support them educationally.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to end this, with those thoughtful comments about the challenges that remain in front of us. And I think those are the two areas you mentioned are definitely ones that I'm going to continue to think about. And I'm sure those of us in the accessibility practice community will take it on as a challenge as well. But I want to thank you, Kisiah, for sharing your story and telling us about your journey. And hopefully you'll have great success in the next things that you're involved with.
Thank you so very much for your time. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.